Some decisions haunt leaders forever. For Rishi Sunak, that decision came on a cold March night in 2024, when he answered a phone call that would either save or destroy his political career. The red folder on his Downing Street desk bore a classification so sensitive that only 3 people in Britain were authorized to read it. Operation Damascus, confidential contact request. The intelligence was stark. Assad's regime was crumbling. Russian support was wavering after 2 years of Ukraine war. Iranian funding had dried up due to internal economic collapse. Syria's military was fragmenting, and for the first time since 2011, Bashar al-Assad looked vulnerable. But instead of fleeing, he was making an unprecedented move, requesting secret talks with Britain. Sunak rubbed his temples. This wasn't just politics, this was explosive. Assad remained one of the world's most wanted war criminals. The man who had gassed his own people, bombed hospitals, and presided over a conflict that killed over 500,000 civilians. Meeting him would be political suicide, but ignoring him might be strategic suicide. Brexit had left Britain isolated in Middle Eastern affairs. France dominated Lebanon, Germany controlled refugee policy, and Russia maintained its Syrian bases. Meanwhile, China was positioning itself for Syria's eventual reconstruction, a trillion-dollar opportunity. Britain was being shut out of its former sphere of influence. His secure phone rang. The display showed only classified incoming. Sunak hesitated for 3 rings before answering. "This is the Prime Minister." The voice was calm, measured, with a slight British accent, remnants of Assad's medical training in London decades earlier. "Mr. Prime Minister, this is Bashar al-Assad. We need to talk." Sunak's blood froze. No diplomatic channels, no intermediaries. Assad himself was calling Downing Street. "I'm listening," Sunak managed. "Syria is ready for peace," Assad continued, his tone betraying no remorse for 13 years of brutality. "But that conversation must happen face to face, away from cameras and crowds. Will you come to Damascus?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Sunak stared out at the London fog, knowing that every word of this conversation would eventually be scrutinized by Parliament, the press, and history itself. Assad was offering the impossible, a chance to end one of the century's worst conflicts. But he was also offering a trap that could destroy Sunak's career and Britain's moral standing. When? Sunak heard himself asking. "Tomorrow night. Private jet, diplomatic immunity. 3 hours, that's all I need." Sunak closed the red folder. He was about to dance with the devil. The whole world would be watching. But what Sunak didn't know was that Assad was playing a different game entirely. One where Britain wasn't the player, it was the pawn. Because in Damascus, a man who had survived 13 years of civil war had learned that the only way to win was to make your enemy believe they were saving you while you destroyed them from within. And Rishi Sunak was about to learn that lesson the hard way. 24 hours later, Sunak found himself staring at the most classified aircraft in the Royal Air Force fleet. No markings, no identification numbers, just sleek grey metal that could disappear from radar at will. His security detail was minimal, 3 men who had sworn oaths deeper than Parliament itself. The Foreign Secretary didn't know. The Defence Minister was kept in the dark. Even the King had been told only that the Prime Minister was conducting sensitive diplomatic reconnaissance. As the jet lifted off from RAF Northolt, Sunak realized there was no turning back. In 6 hours, he would be sitting across from a man who had turned his own country into a graveyard. And somehow, he had to emerge from that room with Britain's interests intact and his conscience still whole. But Assad had been preparing for this moment for months, and he never lost. The Middle East was about to witness something unprecedented, a British Prime Minister walking into the lion's den, but whose teeth would draw blood first. The flight to Damascus felt like traveling into another century. Below, the Mediterranean gave way to Lebanese mountains, then the scarred landscape of western Syria. Bombed-out villages dotted the countryside like missing teeth. Sunak pressed his face to the small window, seeing the cost of Assad's survival written in concrete and dust. This wasn't diplomacy, this was archaeology. He was visiting the ruins of a civilization that Assad had systematically destroyed to save his throne, and somewhere in those ruins a man who had mastered the art of survival was waiting for him. Damascus International Airport felt like stepping into a museum of authoritarian architecture. Concrete brutalism mixed with faded Soviet-era aesthetics, all watched over by portraits of Assad's cold eyes. The runway was empty except for a handful of military jets and cargo planes bearing Russian markings. Sunak's RAF aircraft looked alien against the backdrop of a regime that had been isolated from the West for over a decade. The reception committee was small but significant. 3 black Mercedes sedans, their windows too dark to see inside. Syrian Republican Guard soldiers in ceremonial uniforms, their eyes hidden behind sunglasses despite the approaching dusk. And standing at the center of it all, a thin man in an expensive suit, who radiated authority without ever raising his voice. Prime Minister Sunak, the man said in perfect English. I am Mansour Fadl, advisor to President Assad. Welcome to Damascus. Sunak noticed the title immediately. Not Mr. Fadl Aad, advisor to President Assad. Welcome to Damascus. Sunak noticed the title immediately. Not Mr. Assad or the Syrian leader, President Assad. Even in this first exchange, Assad was establishing the terms of engagement. He was still the legitimate ruler, and this was a meeting between equals. The motorcade moved through Damascus like a funeral procession. The streets were eerily quiet for an evening in the Middle East's oldest continuously inhabited city. Sunak caught glimpses of normal life, children playing in courtyards, shopkeepers closing their stalls, but it felt performative, staged for his benefit. The president chose this route carefully, Fadl explained. These neighborhoods were spared during the Troubles. Syria has always been stronger than its enemies believed. Troubles. That was Assad's word for 13 years of civil war. Sunak bit back his response. He was here to listen first, judge later. But every bombed building they passed told a different story than Fadl's sanitized narrative. The presidential palace appeared through the bulletproof windows like something from a different century. Ottoman architecture enhanced with modern security features, cameras, barriers, men with weapons positioned at intervals that suggested mathematical precision rather than random placement. This was a fortress designed by someone who never forgot that power was temporary and enemies were eternal. Inside, the palace was a study in calculated opulence, Persian carpets that probably cost more than most people's homes, crystal chandeliers that had somehow survived artillery attacks on nearby buildings, oil paintings depicting Syria's ancient glory, alongside photographs of Assad with various world leaders, Putin, Xi Jinping, Rouhani, notably absent any Western faces. The president is waiting in his private study, Fadl announced, leading Sunak through corridors lined with Republican Guard soldiers standing at attention. They stopped at heavy wooden doors that looked medieval but opened with the electronic hum of modern security systems. Fadl knocked twice, received a response in Arabic, then gestured for Sunak to enter. The room was smaller than expected, almost intimate. Bookshelves lined 3 walls, filled with volumes in Arabic, English and French. A desk sat in one corner, papers neatly arranged, and in the center, 2 leather chairs positioned to suggest conversation rather than confrontation. Bashar al-Assad stood with his back to the door, apparently absorbed in a book. When he turned, Sunak was struck by how ordinary he looked. Medium height, thinning hair, wire-rimmed glasses. He could have been a university professor or a doctor, which of course he had been in London decades ago. Rishi, Assad said, extending his hand. The use of his first name was deliberate, immediate, disarming. Thank you for coming. I know this wasn't an easy decision. Sunak shook the offered hand, feeling the surreal weight of the moment. 13 years of war, 500,000 dead, millions displaced, and here was the man responsible, offering tea and speaking like they were old friends catching up. Mr. President, Sunak replied, choosing formality over familiarity. Your invitation was... Assad smiled, an expression that didn't reach his eyes. Please sit. We have much to discuss, and I'm afraid time is shorter than either of us would prefer. As they settled into their chairs, Sunak noticed a photograph on Assad's desk, a family portrait, Assad with his wife and children, all smiles and normal domesticity. It was a reminder that monsters often looked like people, and people could become monsters under the right circumstances. You're wondering why I asked you here, Assad began, pouring tea from a silver service. The answer is simple. Britain matters in ways that perhaps Britain itself has forgotten. He handed Sunak a cup, their fingers briefly touching, and sometimes the only way to end a war is to talk to your enemy. The tea was excellent. Damascene blend with cardamom and rose petals. Assad noticed Sunak's appreciation. My wife's preference, he said. She insists on maintaining certain traditions, even during difficult times. The casual mention of family felt like a small betrayal of the formal atmosphere Sunak had expected. Difficult times, Sunak repeated carefully. Is that how you describe the last 13 years? Assad's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. History will judge what was necessary to preserve Syria's sovereignty. Tonight I'm more interested in what's necessary to secure Syria's future. He stood and walked to the window overlooking Damascus. The city sprawled below them, lights twinkling in neighborhoods that had survived the war. Do you know what I see when I look out there, Rishi? A civilization that has endured for 4,000 years. Romans, Ottomans, French, they all came, they all left. Syria remains. Sunak set down his teacup. Syria remains, but at what cost? half your population displaced, your economy destroyed, your people, my people are alive, Assad interrupted, turning back to face him. The alternative was Libya, Syria, Somalia, failed states where democracy became warlordism and freedom became chaos. His voice carried no emotion, just cold calculation. I chose order over chaos, stability over idealism. The conversation was moving too fast, too deep. Sunak had come expecting diplomatic pleasantries before the real negotiations began. Instead, Assad was forcing him to confront the central moral question. Was Assad's survival worth the price Syria had paid? You asked me here to discuss reconstruction, Sunak said, trying to regain control. Britain is interested in humanitarian aid, refugee repatriation, rebuilding institutions. Britain is interested in Chinese influence. Assad cut him off. Beijing has offered me $50 billion for Syrian reconstruction. They're not asking about human rights or democratic reforms. They're asking about port access and mineral rights. He moved back to his chair, settling with practiced ease. Russia controls my military, Iran controls my militias, but China will control my economy, unless the pause stretched between them. Sunak realized this was the moment Assad had orchestrated from the beginning. The phone call, the secret meeting, the intimate setting, it was all theater leading to this proposition. Unless Britain offers an alternative, Assad continued, your companies need markets, your government needs influence, I need legitimacy. He leaned forward slightly. We can help each other. Sunak felt the trap closing around him. Assad wasn't seeking forgiveness or redemption. He was offering a transaction, British economic partnership in exchange for geopolitical relevance. But accepting meant legitimizing one of the world's most brutal dictators. The international community would never accept, Sunak began. The international community accepted worse, Assad interrupted. They worked with Stalin, Pinochet, Mubarak. They'll work with me eventually. The question is whether Britain will be first, or whether you'll watch China and Russia divide the spoils while you issue meaningless statements from the sidelines. The room fell silent except for the distant sound of Damascus traffic. Sunak stared at the family photograph on Assad's desk, wondering how a father could speak so casually about the destruction of his own country. But perhaps that was exactly the point. Assad had never seen it as destruction. He had seen it as preservation, ugly but necessary. What exactly are you proposing? Sunak asked quietly. Assad smiled for the first time that evening, and it was terrifying in its normalcy. A new beginning, British investment in Syrian reconstruction, technology transfer, educational exchanges, gradual normalization of diplomatic relations. He paused, and in return, Syria remembers its friends when the history books are written. The offer hung in the air like incense, sweet and suffocating. Sunak realized he was facing the kind of decision that would define not just his career but Britain's moral standing for generations. Work with Assad and potentially save thousands of Syrian lives through reconstruction, but legitimize mass murder, refuse, and watch China and Russia carve up the Middle East while Britain became irrelevant. You're asking me to bet Britain's reputation on your survival, Sunak said finally. I'm asking you to bet on reality, Assad replied. I've survived 13 years of war. I'll survive 13 more if necessary. The only question is whether Britain will be my partner or my irrelevant critic. Assad stood and walked to a bookshelf, pulling out a leather-bound volume. Do you know what this is? Churchill's The World Crisis. He wrote about the necessity of working with unsavory allies during wartime. Stalin, for instance. Your greatest prime minister understood that moral purity is a luxury leaders can't afford. The comparison was obscene, but Sunak couldn't deny its cold logic. Britain had allied with Stalin to defeat Hitler. America had worked with Pinochet to contain communism. Realpolitik had always trumped moral consistency in international relations. This isn't 1943, Sunak said. The world has changed. Has it? Assad returned to his seat, placing the book between them like a gauntlet. Ukraine burns while Europe debates sanctions. China builds islands in international waters while America writes protests. Gaza suffers while the UN passes resolutions. The world hasn't changed, Rishi. Only the weapons have gotten more precise. Assad was right, and Sunak hated him for it. The international order that Britain had helped create was crumbling, and countries like China and Russia were writing new rules based on power rather than principle. Britain could maintain its moral high ground and watch from the sidelines, or enter the game and compromise its soul. I need guarantees, Sunak said, surprising himself with the words. Human rights improvements, political reforms, access for humanitarian organizations. Assad nodded slowly. Gradual changes, carefully managed. Syria has been traumatized. Rapid democratization would bring chaos, not freedom. But yes, improvements can be negotiated. The conversation continued for another hour, Assad painting a picture of a new Middle East, where Britain played a central role in Syria's resurrection. He spoke of economic zones, cultural exchanges, strategic partnerships. He made it sound not just pragmatic, but noble, a chance for Britain to heal a wounded nation. But beneath the diplomatic language, Sunak heard something else, Assad's absolute confidence that he had won. Not just the civil war, but this conversation. He had maneuvered Britain's prime minister into a room where moral choices became tactical calculations, where genocide became realpolitik. "I need time to consider this," Sunak said finally. Assad smiled again. "Of course, but remember, Chinese delegations arrive next week. Russian contracts are being signed tomorrow. Time, as you say in English, is money, and money in Syria is influence." As if summoned by telepathy, Fadl appeared in the doorway. "Prime Minister, your aircraft is prepared for departure." Sunak stood, his legs unsteady after sitting for so long. Assad remained seated, confident in his power even as he said goodbye to one of the world's most powerful leaders. "Rishi," Assad said softly, "thank you for coming. I know this wasn't easy, but history will remember those who chose pragmatism over paralysis." They shook hands again, and this time Sunak noticed Assad's grip was firmer, more confident. The Syrian president had gotten what he wanted, a British prime minister who would return to London carrying Assad's proposal, no matter how Sunak ultimately decided. The flight back to London felt like emerging from a fever dream. Sunak sat alone in the aircraft's secure compartment, staring at the folder of notes he'd taken during the conversation. Assad's words replayed in his mind, each argument sharper and more compelling in memory than it had felt in person. The brutal calculus was undeniable. Assad had won his war. He controlled Damascus, Aleppo, the coast. His enemies were scattered in refugee camps or buried in mass graves. Whether Britain liked it or not, Assad was Syria's reality for the foreseeable future. The question was whether to engage with that reality or pretend it didn't exist while China and Russia reaped the benefits. His secure phone buzzed. A message from his chief of staff. "Press asking about your absence." Told them routine diplomatic travel. "How long can we maintain that story?" Sunak typed back. 24 hours. Schedule NSC meeting for tomorrow, Barrow 800. The National Security Council meeting would be a nightmare. How do you explain to the Foreign Secretary that you've been negotiating with a war criminal? How do you tell the Defense Minister that Britain might partner with the man who used chemical weapons against his own people? But the alternative was worse. Sunak pulled out his tablet and reviewed the latest intelligence reports on Chinese activities in Syria. Belt and Road Initiative investments, port construction, mineral extraction agreements. China was positioning itself to control the eastern Mediterranean within a decade. Meanwhile, Russia was consolidating its permanent military presence, turning Syria into a forward base for operations across Africa and the Middle East. If Britain refused Assad's offer, they would wake up in 5 years to find themselves locked out of a strategically crucial region. The Suez Canal, Mediterranean trade routes, Middle Eastern energy supplies, all potentially under Chinese-Russian control, with Britain reduced to issuing protests from the sidelines. His private secretary knocked on the compartment door. "Prime Minister, we're beginning our descent into London." Through the small window, Sunak could see the lights of Greater London spreading to the horizon. 7 million people living their lives, trusting their government to make moral choices on their behalf. But what was moral? Maintaining Britain's integrity while the world changed around them, or compromising principles to preserve influence? The aircraft touched down at RAF Northolt at 3:47 a.m. Sunak's motorcade was waiting, engines running, ready for the silent drive back to Downing Street. As they passed through the deserted London streets, Sunak thought about another leader who had faced impossible choices, Churchill, whose book Assad had quoted. Churchill had allied with Stalin, knowing full well who Stalin was, because the alternative was Nazi victory. But this wasn't 1943. Assad wasn't Stalin, and Syria wasn't the Soviet Union, or was it? In a world where autocrats like Putin and Xi Jinping were rewriting international rules, was moral clarity a luxury Britain couldn't afford? Downing Street was quiet, with only night security and skeletal staff on duty. Sunak walked through the famous door, past portraits of his predecessors, and into his private study. The red folder from 3 days ago still sat on his desk, now joined by new intelligence reports on Syrian reconstruction contracts and Chinese investment proposals. He poured himself a whiskey and stood at the window overlooking the garden. In a few hours, London would wake up, and he would have to decide whether to recommend engaging with Assad or maintaining Britain's isolation from Syrian affairs. Either choice would define his premiership and possibly Britain's future role in the world. The irony wasn't lost on him. Assad had travelled nowhere but had still managed to bring Sunak to his knees. In that Damascus study, surrounded by books and family photographs, a war criminal had offered Britain a devil's bargain disguised as pragmatic diplomacy, and the most terrifying part was that it made strategic sense. The National Security Council meeting began at exactly 8 a.m. in the Cabinet Office briefing room. Foreign Secretary David Cameron, Defense Secretary Grant Shapps, MI6 Chief Richard Moore, and 3 other senior officials sat around the mahogany table, their expressions ranging from curiosity to concern. "Gentlemen," Sunak began, placing the red folder on the table, "I need to brief you on a classified diplomatic contact that occurred in the last 72 hours. Cameron leaned forward. "Prime Minister, your office said you were conducting routine consultations. What kind of contact are we discussing?" Sunak met each man's eyes before answering. "Direct communication with President Assad of Syria. I traveled to Damascus for a 3-hour meeting regarding Syrian reconstruction and Britain's future role in the region." The silence that followed was deafening. Shapps was the first to speak. "Prime Minister, with respect, are you telling us you met with a designated war criminal without consulting this council?" "I am," Sunak replied flatly, "and I'm telling you that Assad made an offer that we need to seriously consider, regardless of our personal feelings about his regime." Moore, the MI6 chief, spoke carefully. "Sir, what kind of offer?" Sunak opened the folder and began reading from his notes. £50 billion in reconstruction contracts for British companies, exclusive access to Syrian port facilities, strategic partnership agreements that would give Britain significant influence in Eastern Mediterranean affairs, and gradual political reforms managed in consultation with British advisors. Cameron shook his head. The international community would never accept legitimization of Assad's regime. The EU, the Americans work with the Saudis. Sunak interrupted. The EU works with Erdogan. The international community works with whoever serves their interests. The question is whether Britain will maintain its moral purity while China and Russia divide the spoils. Shapps looked incredulous. "Prime Minister, this man used chemical weapons against children. British forces have been involved in operations against his regime. How can we justify?" "We justify it," Sunak cut him off, "by preventing Chinese domination of the Mediterranean, by ensuring Syrian refugees can eventually return home, by maintaining British influence in a region that controls 20% of global trade routes." His voice hardened. "Or we can issue moral statements while our competitors write the rules of the New World Order." Moore consulted his briefing papers. "Prime Minister, our intelligence suggests Assad's position is more fragile than he appears. Russian support is wavering. Iranian financing is limited. We might be negotiating with a regime on the verge of collapse. Or we might be missing our last chance to engage before he consolidates power permanently," Sunak replied. "Assad has survived 13 years of civil war. He's not going anywhere. The question is whether Britain will be inside the tent or outside." The debate continued for 2 hours. Cameron argued for maintaining Britain's moral leadership. Shapps worried about military implications. Moore questioned Assad's trustworthiness. But gradually, the cold logic of geopolitics began to dominate the discussion. "What are you proposing specifically?" Cameron asked finally. Sunak pulled out a second document. "Phased engagement, initial humanitarian cooperation, followed by limited economic partnerships, then gradual diplomatic normalization contingent on human rights improvements. We test Assad's commitments step by step while positioning Britain for larger opportunities. And if Parliament objects, if the public finds out we're negotiating with Assad," Shapps asked. "We frame it as pragmatic peacemaking," Sunak said. "Britain taking the lead in ending one of the century's worst conflicts, bringing Assad in from the cold through constructive engagement rather than permanent isolation." The room fell silent again. Every person at the table understood the stakes. Britain's post-Brexit strategy depended on finding new sources of influence and economic opportunity. Syria represented both, but at an enormous moral cost. "I need a recommendation from this council," Sunak said finally. "Do we pursue Assad's proposal or maintain our current policy of isolation?" Cameron spoke first. "I recommend extreme caution. Any engagement must be deniable, reversible, and tied to concrete improvements in human rights." Shapps nodded reluctantly. "If we proceed, it must be through private channels with built-in exit strategies." Moore was more direct. "From an intelligence perspective, engagement offers opportunities to influence Syrian policy while monitoring Assad's true intentions. But the reputational risks are enormous." Sunak looked around the table. "Then we're agreed on cautious engagement." Reluctant nods around the room. Britain was about to dance with the devil, and every person in that room knew it might destroy them all. 3 weeks later, the first British humanitarian delegation arrived in Damascus. The visit was announced as exploratory discussions regarding refugee repatriation and infrastructure assessment. The media barely noticed Syria had fallen off the front pages years ago, replaced by Ukraine, Gaza, and domestic political scandals. But Assad noticed. He welcomed the delegation personally, appearing in carefully staged photographs, distributing aid packages and discussing reconstruction plans. The images were broadcast across Syrian state media and shared by Assad's supporters worldwide. The Syrian president working constructively with British officials, proving his legitimacy and moderation. Sunak watched the coverage from Downing Street, feeling sick to his stomach. The first phase of engagement was working exactly as Assad had planned. British presence was legitimizing his regime, while Assad offered just enough cooperation to justify continued engagement. The humanitarian delegation returned with glowing reports. Syrian officials had been cooperative, even helpful. Access to refugee camps had been granted. Preliminary agreements on infrastructure projects had been signed. Assad was keeping his promises, at least superficially. But late-night intelligence reports told a different story. Political prisoners were being transferred to hidden facilities before British inspections. Reconstruction contracts were being structured to benefit Assad's inner circle. Syrian security forces were using British presence as proof that the international community was ready to forgive and forget. "He's playing us," Sunak muttered to his private secretary during a late-evening briefing. "Every handshake, every photo opportunity. He's using us to wash away 13 years of war crimes. But backing out now would be even worse." The Chinese delegation had arrived in Damascus, offering $60 billion in reconstruction funding with no political conditions attached. Russian military advisors were drafting long-term security agreements. If Britain withdrew, they would lose any chance of influencing Syrian policy while handing Assad a propaganda victory. The phone call came at 11:30 p.m., 2 days before Parliament was scheduled to debate Syrian policy. Assad himself calling Sunak's secure line. "Rishi, my friend." Assad's voice was warm, familiar. "I wanted to thank you personally for your courage. The humanitarian cooperation has been excellent." "Mr. President," Sunak replied formally, "I hope you understand that continued cooperation depends on seeing real progress on human rights and political reforms." Assad chuckled softly. "Of course, these things take time, as you know. But I have good news. Syria is ready to discuss expanded cooperation. Energy partnerships, perhaps. Your North Sea expertise could be very valuable in developing Syrian offshore resources." Sunak felt the trap closing tighter. Each success led to larger commitments, deeper entanglement. Assad was a master of the gradual compromise, the incremental surrender of principles in exchange for marginal gains. "I'll need to discuss this with my cabinet," Sunak said. "Naturally. But remember, the Chinese are offering immediate terms. They don't require extensive consultations or moral committees. They make decisions quickly." A pause. "I hope Britain can match their efficiency." After the call ended, Sunak sat alone in his study, staring at the photograph on his desk, his own wife and children, smiling at a family gathering. Assad had shown him a similar photograph in Damascus, using family imagery to humanize himself while defending the inhuman. The truth was devastating in its simplicity. Assad had won, not just the civil war, but this larger game of international legitimization. He had maneuvered Britain into becoming his unwilling partner in rehabilitation. Every British official who shook his hand, every aid package delivered through Syrian government channels, every photograph of cooperation was another brick in the wall of his restored legitimacy, and there was no way out. Withdrawing now would mean admitting that Britain had been manipulated by a war criminal, destroying Sunak's government and Britain's credibility. Continuing meant deeper complicity in Assad's normalization campaign, making Britain a partner in legitimizing mass murder. The next morning brought news that would define both Sunak's legacy and Britain's future role in the Middle East. But as he prepared to face Parliament's questions about Syrian policy, Rishi Sunak understood that in the game between moral leadership and geopolitical relevance, Assad had forced him to choose, and whatever choice he made, Assad had already won.